The summons came on a Tuesday, and I remember thinking how strange it was that something so ordinary could carry something so terrible. The process server was a kid, maybe 25, wearing a polo shirt with sweat circles under the arms. Phoenix in late June will do that to you. He stood at the front desk of Desert Bloom Memory Care and asked the receptionist if a Mr. Whitfield was on the premises. She knew me. I'd been there every single day for 37 months. She pointed down the hall toward Sandra's room without a word. I was spooning applesauce into my wife's mouth when he found me. Sandra didn't look up. She hadn't recognized me in over a year, but she still opened her mouth when food came near, still chewed slowly, still let me wipe her chin with the corner of a napkin. The kid stood in the doorway holding a manila envelope, and I could tell from his face that he didn't want to be there. I told him to set it on the side table. He apologized. He actually said the word sorry twice before he left. I finished feeding her. That part matters to me. I finished the applesauce, then the small cup of pudding. Then I held a straw to her lips for the apple juice. I wiped her face. I tucked the blanket up under her arms because the air conditioning ran cold in that wing. I kissed the top of her head where her hair used to be thick and dark and was now thin and white as cotton. Only after all that did I sit down in the chair beside her bed and open the envelope. My name is Holland Besper. I'm 71 years old. I spent 43 years as a structural engineer for Boeing in Seattle before we retired down here for the dry air, which the doctor said would help Sandra's lungs after the pneumonia. That was 8 years ago. The dry air didn't save her lungs, and it sure didn't save her mind, but it gave us 4 good years before the diagnosis came, and for that I'll always be grateful to the desert. The papers in the envelope said my daughter-in-law, a woman named Brielle, was suing me for sexual harassment. 6 counts, each one tied to a specific family gathering between October of the previous year and May of the current one. A Thanksgiving dinner at my son Curtis's house in Scottsdale. A Christmas Eve gathering at the same house. A birthday party for my grandson in February. An Easter brunch in Tempe. A Mother's Day lunch at a restaurant called Sage and Stone. And finally, my granddaughter's 10th birthday at a trampoline park in Mesa. I read the dates twice. Then a third time. Then I started to laugh, and Sandra turned her head slightly because she still responded to sounds even if she didn't know what they meant, and I had to put my hand over my mouth to stop myself because I didn't want to scare her. I hadn't been at any of those gatherings. Not one. I hadn't left Sandra's side for more than 4 hours at a stretch in over 3 years. I ate dinner in that room. I slept in a fold-out chair beside her bed 3 or 4 nights a week. The staff at Desert Bloom knew me better than my own children at this point. I had a key card that logged every entry and exit. The lobby had cameras. The hallways had cameras. The dining room had cameras. There were nurses who came on shift at 6 in the morning and left at 6 at night, who saw me arrive before them and leave after them, day after day after day, for 37 months running. The lawsuit asked for $300,000 in damages, plus a permanent restraining order keeping me 500 yards from Brielle, my son Curtis, my grandchildren, and any property they owned or rented. The court date was set for August 22nd, 7 weeks away. I sat there in the chair next to Sandra and I felt the floor go out from under me, the way it does sometimes. Not panic, just that hollowed-out feeling, like when the doctor first said the word Alzheimer's and Sandra reached over and squeezed my hand and said, "Well, okay, let's figure it out." And then for the next 18 months pretended it wasn't happening because that's how she handled hard things. I called my son first. I didn't know what else to do. Curtis is 44, an emergency room physician, and he's always been the level-headed one of our 2 boys. His older brother Dennis lives in Portland, and we don't talk much anymore for reasons that have nothing to do with this story. I called Curtis on his cell and got his voicemail. I called the hospital where he worked and got a charge nurse who said he was on shift, but couldn't be pulled out for a personal call unless it was an emergency. I said it was. She put me on hold. After 11 minutes, Curtis came on the line, and his voice was tight and clipped, and I knew before I said a word that he already knew. He said, "Dad, I can't talk about this." He said, "My lawyer told me I can't have any contact with you while this is pending." He said, "You need to get your own attorney." He said, "I'm sorry," and then he hung up. I I sat with the phone in my hand and looked at Sandra. She was asleep now, mouth slightly open, breathing the slow, shallow breath of someone whose body was forgetting how to do things, one cell at a time. I thought about how she would have handled this, the old Sandra before. She would have called Curtis back and made him listen. She would have driven to Scottsdale and walked into that house and looked Brielle in the eye and asked her what in God's name she thought she was doing. Sandra was 5'2" and she could clear a room when she was angry. I had relied on that for 46 years. Now there was just me. I called an attorney that afternoon. A man named Roland Pickett, who had handled our estate planning back when we first moved to Phoenix. He's older than me, must be close to 80 by now, and he answered his own phone, which was the first thing that made me trust him all over again. I told him what was happening. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Holland, I want you to listen carefully. This is the easiest case I will ever defend. You have not been at any of these locations. You have a documented, time-stamped, video-corroborated alibi for 37 straight months. Whatever this is about, it is not about what they say it is about. So we need to figure out what it's actually about." He told me to come to his office the next morning. He told me to bring everything. The lawsuit, my keycard statements from Desert Bloom, my credit card statements showing where I'd bought groceries and gas, anything I had. He told me not to call Curtis again, not to call Brielle, not to call anyone in the family until we'd talked. That night, I sat in the fold-out chair next to Sandra and I didn't sleep. I watched her breathe and I tried to make sense of it. Brielle had married Curtis 9 years ago. She was 36 now, a real estate agent in Scottsdale. The kind of woman who wore her hair in a high, tight ponytail and posted pictures of herself on Instagram standing in front of houses she'd just sold. I'd never been close to her, but I'd never disliked her either. We'd had Thanksgiving dinners and birthdays and the usual family things, back when Sandra was still well enough to come along. Brielle had always been polite to me. A little distant, maybe. Sandra used to say Brielle had walls up. But Sandra said that about a lot of people, and she was usually right. I tried to think of the last time I'd actually seen Brielle in person. It was maybe 2.5 years ago. Curtis had brought the kids to visit Sandra at the facility, and Brielle had come with them. She'd stood in the doorway of Sandra's room and hadn't come inside. She kept her hands in her pockets and looked at the floor. The kids had been 6 and 8 at the time. They'd hugged me and shown Sandra their drawings, and Sandra had patted them on the head without recognizing them, and Brielle had watched all of this from the hallway with an expression I couldn't read. After that visit, Curtis had stopped bringing the family. He came alone now, every other Sunday, for 45 minutes. He sat with Sandra and held her hand and told her about the kids' school and his cases at the hospital, and Sandra didn't know who he was. And afterward, he and I would walk to the parking lot, and he would cry in his car for a few minutes before driving home. I knew because I could see his car from the lobby window. I never let on that I saw. The morning I went to Roland's office, I asked the head nurse at Desert Bloom, a woman named Yolanda who had become almost a friend over the years, if I could get printouts of my keycard entries for the past 9 months. She said she'd have them ready by the time I got back. She also asked, in a quieter voice, if everything was okay. I said no, but it was going to be. She squeezed my arm. The staff at that place have a kind of love for the people who keep showing up. They know who comes and who doesn't. Roland's office was in a strip mall in central Phoenix, between a tax preparer and a Vietnamese restaurant. He was wearing a bolo tie. His desk was covered in folders. He shook my hand with both of his and told me to sit down. Then he poured me coffee from a thermos he kept on a side table because, he said, the office machine made coffee that tasted like burnt rope. He read through the lawsuit while I sat there. He took notes on a yellow legal pad with a fountain pen. When he was done, he looked up and said, "Holland, do you understand what's happening here?" I said I didn't. He said, "Somebody wants something from you, or wants you out of something. This is a pressure play. The lawsuit isn't about damages. It's a means to an end. We need to figure out what the end is." I told him I didn't have much. Sandra and I had sold the house in Seattle when we moved down. We had a small condo in Phoenix that I rarely went to anymore. We had retirement savings, maybe $700,000 still in there after the years of memory care Cost eating into it. We had Sandra's life insurance policy, which would pay out when she passed. And we had the family trust that Sandra's mother had set up 40 years ago, which was the thing that would matter. Roland's pen stopped. He asked about the trust. The trust was Sandra's mother's money, originally. She died in 1991 and had left a substantial inheritance to Sandra, with provisions that it would pass to our children and grandchildren on Sandra's death. Over the decades, it had grown. Last time I looked at the statements, the trust was worth around $4.6 million. Sandra was the sole income beneficiary while she was alive. On her death, it split among our children and their descendants, with specific allocations for the grandchildren that I, as trustee, controlled until they turned 25. Roland set his pen down very carefully. He said, "Holland, who's the trustee after you?" I told him. "After me, Curtis was the named successor trustee," he said. "And if you were removed as trustee for cause before Sandra's passing, who would step in?" "Curtis. Curtis would." Roland leaned back in his chair. He said, "Well, there it is," he said. "Your daughter-in-law isn't suing you for harassment. She's suing you to get you removed as trustee. A felony conviction, or even a serious civil judgment for sexual misconduct against a family member would almost certainly trigger the morals clause in that trust. Once you're out, your son's in. And your son's wife is married to the man who controls $4.6 million. I sat there, and I thought about Brielle, the high, tight ponytail, the careful distance she'd kept from Sandra's hospital room. I thought about Curtis crying in his car. I thought about the fact that Curtis had an attorney telling him not to talk to me, which meant Curtis had hired a lawyer before any of this came to light, which meant Curtis knew. He knew. Maybe not the details, maybe not the exact lies, but he knew enough to lawyer up before the papers landed. I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. I felt awake. Roland walked me through what we were going to do. First, we would gather every shred of documentation proving where I'd been on each of those 6 dates. Second, we would file a response demanding specific evidence from Brielle, including witness names, photographs, anything she claimed to have. Third, we would request a deposition. Fourth, and this was the part Roland leaned forward to emphasize, we would not tip our hand about the trust. Let them think we thought it was just a sleazy lawsuit. Let them get comfortable. Let them get sloppy. I asked him if Curtis was in on it. Roland said he didn't know yet. He said it was possible Curtis was being manipulated. He said it was possible Curtis was the architect. He said the only way to find out was to keep going. That afternoon, I drove back to Desert Bloom, and Yolanda had a stack of printouts waiting for me. Every keycard entry and exit for the past year. I took them to a Kinko's and made 3 copies of everything. Then I went to my bank and pulled credit card statements, going back 2 years. Then I went home to the condo, which I hadn't slept in for over a month, and I sat at the kitchen table and started building a timeline. October 17th, Thanksgiving dinner at Curtis's house. Allegedly 6 p.m. to 10 p.m. According to the lawsuit, I had cornered Brielle in the kitchen pantry and made unwanted physical contact during this period. According to my keycard, I'd entered Desert Bloom at 5:42 p.m. that day and left at 11:06 p.m. According to the receipt in my wallet, I'd ordered a turkey sandwich and coffee from the cafeteria at 7:15 p.m. According to the nursing log, which I requested the next day, I'd been with Sandra during the entire 7 o'clock medication round and had spoken to the night nurse, a woman named Pauline, at 9:40. December 24th. Christmas Eve gathering. Alleged incident at approximately 8 p.m. in the upstairs hallway of Curtis's home. My keycard showed me entering Desert Bloom at 4:15 p.m. and leaving at the following morning at 7:42 a.m. I had spent Christmas Eve sleeping in the fold-out chair next to my wife. The nursing staff had brought me a paper plate of turkey and stuffing from the staff potluck. I remembered it because Sandra had cried that night, which she did sometimes, and I'd held her hand for an hour until she settled. February 9th, grandson's birthday party. Alleged inappropriate touching during cake. Keycard. Entered 9:11 a.m. Left 8:30 p.m. Receipts from the Onset Cafe at noon and 4 p.m. April 5th. Easter brunch in Tempe. Alleged incident at approximately 1 p.m. Key card showed me at Desert Bloom from 7 a.m. to 9 p.m. that day. A photograph on my phone, geotagged and time-stamped, of me holding Sandra's hand during the facility's Easter service at 1:15 p.m. The chaplain had blessed the residents one by one. There were 42 people in that room. Most were patients, but their family members were there too. At least 15 witnesses. May 11th. Mother's Day lunch at Sage and Stone Restaurant. Alleged inappropriate comments during dessert. Keycard showed me at Desert Bloom from 6 a.m. to 10:30 p.m. I'd brought Sandra a corsage. There were photographs. The activities director had taken them. May 20th. Granddaughter's 10th birthday at the trampoline park in Mesa. Alleged incident in the parking lot. Keycard at Desert Bloom from 7 a.m. to 9 p.m. Sandra had a respiratory scare that day. The on-call doctor had been paged at 3:30 p.m. I'd been there when he arrived. Signed the consent form for the chest x-ray. The signature was on file. I built the timeline on a yellow legal pad and I sat back and looked at it and I thought, this is too easy. Roland was right. This wasn't an attempt to win in court. This was an attempt to make me settle. To make me agree to step away from the trust quietly in exchange for Brielle dropping the suit. They probably expected me to be terrified, an old man worried about his reputation, willing to do anything to make the embarrassment go away. I drove back to Desert Bloom that night and slept in the chair next to Sandra. I told her, even though she couldn't understand, that someone was trying to take something from us. I told her I wasn't going to let them. She turned her head slightly toward the sound of my voice. Sometimes I wondered if some part of her still recognized me, deep underneath. Sometimes I had to wonder that to keep going. Roland filed our response that Friday. We denied all 6 counts. We attached the timeline as a preliminary exhibit. We requested specific identification of witnesses, copies of any photographic or video evidence, and a deposition of Brielle within 30 days. Brielle's attorney was a woman named Margot Friel, the kind of lawyer who advertised on bus benches and billboards and had a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Her response came a week later. She named 4 witnesses. 3 were Brielle's friends from her real estate brokerage. 1 was Brielle's mother, who lived in San Diego and had supposedly been at Thanksgiving and the Mother's Day lunch. Roland and I went through the witness list and started checking. The friends from the brokerage were easy enough to find on social media. We weren't going to contact them directly, but we could see who they were, where they posted from, what their lives looked like. 2 of them had posted photos from the Thanksgiving in question. Curtis's house. Brielle in a red dress. The friends laughing around a table. I scanned every face in every photo. I wasn't there. Of course I wasn't. But here's what I noticed. In one of the photos taken from across the dining room, you could see into the kitchen. And in the kitchen, leaning against the counter with a beer in his hand, was a man I'd never seen before. Tall, white hair, glasses. About my age, maybe a little younger. He was laughing at something Curtis was saying. I showed the photo to Roland. He looked at it for a long time. He said, "Holland, do you have any cousins or old friends we should know about?" I said no. Sandra's family was small and most of them were dead. Mine too. There was no one in our circle who looked like that man. Roland made a phone call to a private investigator he'd worked with for 20 years, a former Phoenix homicide detective named Dale Nakamura. Dale came over to Roland's office the next afternoon. He was 65 maybe, and he had hands like leather and a voice like gravel. He looked at the photo for a long time. Then he said, "Who is this guy and how do we find him?" We had no name. We had nothing. But Dale had ways. He took copies of all 6 dates. The names of the 4 witnesses, the names of Brielle and Curtis. And he disappeared for 10 days. When he came back, he had a folder. We met at Roland's office on a Wednesday morning in late July. The man in the photo was named Wendell Brockton, 64 years old. He had moved to Scottsdale from Las Vegas 18 months ago. Before that, he had lived in Reno for 6 years, Before that, Sacramento. He had a real estate license that had been suspended twice for ethics violations. He had 2 civil judgments against him in Nevada for elder financial abuse, both settled out of court. He had no criminal record, but Dale's contact in the Nevada Attorney General's office had told him that Brockton was on a list of people the state had been watching for years. He targeted older women, usually wealthy widows. He befriended them. He inserted himself into their lives. He helped them with paperwork. And by the time anyone noticed, money had moved. Dale set the folder down. He said, "Holland, here's what I think happened. I think Wendell Brockton met your daughter-in-law sometime in the last year and a half. I think he saw the same thing she saw, a trust worth nearly $5 million with you as the only obstacle. I think Brockton has done variations of this before, with himself as the inserted boyfriend or financial advisor. This time, he found a partner. Your daughter-in-law had access. He had the playbook. I asked about Curtis. Dale said, your son is the part I can't quite figure out. He's either complicit, or he's being played, or he's somewhere in between. The lawsuit was filed in Brielle's name only, but the financial benefit goes to Curtis as the next trustee. So if it's just a marital scheme, Curtis is in on it. If it's something else, Brielle and Brockton are setting up Curtis too. I sat with that for a while. My son. I thought about all the years of him as a kid, fishing trips on the Olympic Peninsula. Him as a teenager wanting to be a doctor, like his mother's brother had been. Him at his medical school graduation, hugging Sandra so hard, he lifted her off the ground. I thought about him crying in his car after his Sunday visits. I didn't want him to be in on it. But I had to be ready for the possibility. Roland filed for the deposition. He requested it be held at his office in Phoenix. Brielle's attorney pushed back, asked for it to be in Scottsdale at her firm's office. We agreed because we wanted them to feel in control. The deposition was set for August 4th, 6 days before the trial date. In the meantime, Dale kept working. He pulled property records, phone records he could legally access, social media archives, court filings. He found Wendell Brockton's address, a rental property in Old Town Scottsdale. He found that Brockton's car had been in Curtis's driveway twice in the last 3 months, both times during business hours when Curtis was at the hospital. He found that Brielle had transferred $15,000 to a holding company in Nevada in March, and that the holding company was registered to a name that turned out to be one of Brockton's previous aliases. Dale also found something else. He found that Brielle had been quietly meeting with a financial advisor in Phoenix, asking detailed questions about the mechanics of changing trustees on a multi-million-dollar irrevocable trust. The advisor was a friend of Dale's wife's cousin. Phoenix is a smaller town than people think. 2 days before the deposition, Roland called me in. He said, "Holland, we have a choice. We can blow this case up at the deposition. We can show them everything we have, and they will fold immediately, and the lawsuit will go away. Or we can sit on it. We can let them dig their hole deeper. We can wait until the day of trial, and we can bury them in front of the judge, and we can make sure that Brielle and Brockton both face criminal charges, and we can make absolutely sure that Curtis can never be the trustee of anything ever again." I asked what he recommended. He said, "Holland, that's not my decision." He said, "The first option protects your son. The second option destroys him." I went back to Desert Bloom that night and I sat with Sandra. She was awake, eyes open, staring at the ceiling. She'd been less responsive that week. The doctors had warned me her decline was accelerating. I held her hand and I thought about Curtis. I thought about what kind of father I'd been. I thought about whether he'd done this thing because he was greedy, or because he was weak, or because Brielle had pushed him into it, or because some part of him had always resented me for things I didn't even know about. I thought about Sandra. The old Sandra. What she would have done. Sandra would have given him a chance. She would have wanted to know if he was being played before she destroyed him. That was who she was. Even when she was angry. Even when she was right. I called Roland the next morning. I told him to pick option 1. with a condition. I wanted Brockton exposed, fully. Criminal charges, civil judgments, the works. And I wanted Brielle to face consequences. But I wanted Curtis to have a chance to come clean before we went public. Roland was quiet on the phone. Then he said, "Holland, you're a better man than I would be. I'm going to tell you that. And then I'm going to make it happen." The deposition was held in a conference room with glass walls on the 11th floor of a building in Scottsdale that overlooked the McDowell Mountains. Brielle sat across from me wearing a navy blue suit, hair in the high tight ponytail. Margot Friel sat next to her in a yellow blazer that looked like it had been ironed that morning. There was a court reporter, a young man with rimless glasses. There was a conference phone in the middle of the table for Curtis to call in if he wanted, which he hadn't. I sat next to Roland. I had a folder in front of me. I had not said a word to Brielle since I'd walked in. She had not looked at me directly. Her eyes flicked to mine once when I sat down, and then she looked at her hands, and her hands were trembling slightly. Roland began the deposition by asking Brielle to confirm the dates and times of the alleged incidents. She did, working from the lawsuit document. He asked her to describe the incidents in her own words. She did, haltingly, with details that Margot must have helped her rehearse. She described me cornering her in the pantry on Thanksgiving, made physical contact with her shoulder and lower back, made a comment she described as inappropriate. She described similar incidents at each of the other gatherings. The pattern was clear and consistent. Roland let her finish. He let her tell every story. He let her get all the way through. Then he opened his own folder. He laid out the timeline, date by date, keycard entries, receipts, nursing logs, photographs with timestamps, witness statements from staff at Desert Bloom. He laid out 23 pieces of documentary evidence, proving I had not been at any of those locations on any of those dates. He laid out additional evidence showing I had not left Desert Bloom for more than 4 hours at a stretch in over 3 years. He showed the security camera footage from the Easter service, with me clearly visible in the second row, holding Sandra's hand, while Brielle claimed I'd been making inappropriate advances at a brunch in Tempe 40 miles away. Brielle's face went white. Margot Friel's face went white. Margot Friel's face went red. Then Roland slid one more photograph across the table. It was the Thanksgiving photo. Brielle in red. Friends laughing. And in the kitchen in the background, Wendell Brocken with a beer in his hand. Roland said, "Mrs. Vesper, do you know this man?" Brielle stared at the photograph. She didn't speak. Roland said, "Mrs. Vesper, his name is Wendell Brockton. He has a long history of inserting himself into wealthy families to extract assets. He has been involved in 2 prior cases of elder financial abuse in the state of Nevada. We have evidence of $15,000 you transferred to one of his shell companies in March of this year. We have evidence of his car at your home on multiple occasions when your husband was at work. We have evidence of you meeting with a financial advisor to ask about changing trustees on the family trust. Mrs. Vesper, do you know this man?" Brielle started crying. Margot Friel told her not to answer. Brielle cried harder. Margot called for a recess. Roland said, "Of course. Take all the time you need." We sat in the lobby for 40 minutes. I drank a paper cup of bad coffee and looked out at the mountains. Roland made a phone call to someone I didn't ask about. Dale Nakamura was in the parking lot in his car. He had Brockton under surveillance and would be there until something happened. When we came back into the conference room, Brielle had stopped crying. Margot Friel looked like she'd aged 5 years in 40 minutes. She said her client wished to discuss settlement. Roland said settlement isn't on the table. He said what is on the table is this. Mrs. Vesper drops the lawsuit immediately with prejudice. She signs an affidavit explaining what really happened, naming Wendell Brockton as the architect. She agrees to cooperate with the criminal investigation that will follow. She agrees to terms regarding her relationship with the family trust that we will negotiate in writing. In exchange, my client will not pursue civil damages against her personally. We will not seek to involve her children. We will allow her the dignity of working through her marriage with her husband privately. Margot Friel asked for time to consult with her client. Roland said, You have 1 hour. Brielle signed the affidavit that afternoon. The criminal case against Wendell Brockton came together fast. The Phoenix police, working with the Arizona Attorney General's office, had a file on him already, just waiting for someone to give them probable cause. Brielle's affidavit gave them everything. Brockton was arrested at his rental in Old Town Scottsdale 8 days later. He was charged with conspiracy to commit fraud, financial elder abuse, and several counts related to the prior Nevada cases that the state had been holding off on for lack of cooperating witnesses. He's waiting trial as I tell you this. Roland thinks he'll do 12 to 15 years. Curtis came to Desert Bloom 3 days after Brockton's arrest. He came alone. He stood in the doorway of Sandra's room the way Brielle had 2.5 years before, with his hands in his pockets, looking at the floor. I told him to come in. He sat down in the chair on the other side of Sandra's bed. He didn't speak for a while. He looked at his mother. Her eyes were closed. The afternoon light was coming through the window in long bars across the blanket. He said, "Dad, I didn't know." He said it 3 or 4 different ways. He said he'd known something was off with Brielle for over a year. He said money had been disappearing from their joint accounts, and she'd had explanations every time. He said she'd been pulling away from him, working late, taking trips with girlfriends he wasn't sure existed. He said when she told him she was filing the lawsuit, she'd told him I'd been sending her threatening texts for months, and that I'd snapped at recent gatherings, and that everyone was afraid of me. She'd showed him texts that looked like they came from my number. She'd cried. She'd been afraid, or she'd performed being afraid. He'd believed her, because he hadn't wanted to believe the alternative. He said, "When my lawyer told me I couldn't talk to you, I was relieved. I'm ashamed to say that. I was relieved because it meant I didn't have to look at you and ask if it was true." I let him talk. I didn't interrupt. When he was done, I said, "Curtis, your wife was being run by a con artist. He targeted her. He may have manipulated her into marrying him in a sense, or into pretending. I don't know yet how deep it goes. But you have to decide what you do now." He said, "What do I do?" I said, "You find out who she is, the real one. And then you decide if you can live with her." He said, "Will you help me?" I said, "I'll help you figure out the truth. I won't tell you what to do with it." He nodded. He cried a little, quietly, the way he had in his car. He held his mother's hand. He said, "Mom, I'm sorry." Sandra didn't open her eyes, but her fingers twitched against his palm, the way they sometimes did when she heard a familiar voice. Curtis put his head down on the edge of her blanket and cried harder. I sat there with my son crying over his mother, and I thought, this is what it costs. This is what these people cost you. They take something you can't get back, even when you win. The lawsuit was officially dismissed in early September, with a notation that the plaintiff acknowledged the claims were unfounded. Brockton's preliminary hearing is in November. Brielle and Curtis are in counseling. They're not living together right now. She's staying with her mother in San Diego. Curtis has the kids. He brings them to Desert Bloom every Sunday now. They do drawings for Sandra. They sit on the bed with her and tell her about school. She doesn't know who they are. They know that. They come anyway. That's something Curtis taught them in the last few weeks, and I'm proud of him for it, even with everything. Sandra passed on October 17th. She slipped away in the middle of the night with me holding one hand and Curtis holding the other. Yolanda, the head nurse, was there. She'd come in on her day off when the night staff called her. We all stood there together in the small lamplit room and watched her go. She didn't struggle. She didn't seem afraid. After 38 months of disappearing, she finally just left, and the body she left behind looked smaller than I remembered her ever being. The trust transferred according to its terms. Curtis became trustee. We discussed at length whether to modify the morals clause to include Brielle, to protect the trust from her in case the marriage didn't last. We decided to leave it alone. Curtis said he wanted to be the trustee his mother had wanted him to be, and that meant managing it for the kids, not against the kids' mother. I think Sandra would have approved. I'm 71 years old, and I sleep in my own bed now. In the condo in Phoenix that I hadn't really lived in for 3 years. I'm learning what it's like to wake up alone. I'm learning how to cook for one. I have a list of things I want to do before I run out of time. I want to drive up to the Olympic Peninsula one more time. I want to go to a Mariners game with Curtis. I want to teach my granddaughter to fish. I'm not sure how much of any of that I'll get done, but the list itself is more than I had a year ago. I want to tell you a few things before I'm done. I'm not a wise man. I'm an engineer. I built bridges and assembly lines and things that had to hold up under stress. And what I learned about stress is that the failure point is almost never where you expected. It's never the big load. It's always the small flaw you didn't notice, the corrosion you didn't measure, the bolt you didn't torque to spec because you were tired that day. Families are like that. The thing that takes you down is almost never the thing you were watching for. I was watching for cancer. I was watching for car accidents. I was watching for the slow grief of my wife disappearing into her own mind. I never watched for somebody walking up to my son's wife in a coffee shop and turning her head with a smile and a story and a calculator running underneath. I want to tell you something about the technology of all of this. The phone records, the spoofed texts that Brielle showed Curtis, the photographs Brockton's people took, the Facebook profiles that turned out to be ghosts. None of this would have been possible 20 years ago. Or it would have been possible, but it would have taken more skill than most criminals have. Now you can buy a fake identity online. You can spoof any number you want. You can clone a voice from a 30-second sample. The world we live in is a world where reality is increasingly negotiable. And that's a hard truth to swallow when you're 71 years old and you grew up trusting documents. But here's the other side of it. The same technology that nearly destroyed me also saved me. The keycard system at Desert Bloom logged every entry and exit. The cameras in the hallways recorded my every comings and goings. The credit card receipts had timestamps. The geotagged photos on my phone placed me in a specific room at a specific minute. The same digital trail that lets a stalker fake a presence also makes it impossible to fake an absence, if you have the patience to put the records in order. So if I can leave you with one piece of advice, it's this. Document your life, not for vanity, not for show. Document it because someday someone may try to tell a story about you that isn't true, and the only thing that will save you is the boring, unglamorous, time-stamped, receipt-keeping habit of a person who pays attention. I never thought my keycard statements would matter. Now I think they were the most important pieces of paper I ever held in my hands. And here's one last thing. Forgiveness is complicated. I don't fully forgive Brielle, and I don't know that I ever will, but I have decided that I don't need to spend whatever time I have left being eaten by what she did. The man who tried to use her, Wendell Brockton, will spend years in prison. The lawsuit is dismissed. My name is clear. My son and I are talking again, and slowly, painfully, finding our way back to something that resembles a relationship. My wife is at peace. My grandchildren visit me on weekends and ask me questions about Boeing and bridges and what their grandmother was like before she got sick. I tell them everything I can remember. I'm trying to remember more. There's a thing they say about steel under load, that it doesn't fail all at once. It bends first. It bends and bends, taking on more weight, shifting its shape, until something gives. The thing about old men is the same. We bend. We bend a long way. People who underestimate us, people who think we're too weak or too tired or too distracted by grief to fight back, they don't understand that bending isn't breaking. They don't understand that steel that is bent and held under load is stronger than steel that has never been tested. I'm still standing. My wife is gone, but I'm standing. My family is bruised, but it's intact. My truth held. And that's what I'd want anyone listening to know. The truth has its own weight. Lies are loud and fast, and they get the early lead. But truth, if you give it time, if you keep showing up, if you keep the records, if you don't let them shake you off, the truth will do the work. You just have to outlast the people who underestimated you. That's all I've got. That's the whole story. I hope, wherever you are, whatever you're carrying, that you find your own version of the records I kept. The proof that you were where you said you were. The proof that you're who you said you were. The proof that you're who you said you were. Hold on to it. Someday it might be the only thing standing between you and a lie that wants to swallow you whole. I've thought about this a lot in the months since Sandra passed, sitting alone in the condo I barely lived in for 3 years. And what I keep coming back to is the simple arithmetic of choices. Rael didn't wake up one morning a thief. She bent toward something small first, a flattering conversation with a stranger named Wendell Brockton, a willingness to listen when she should have walked away. She told herself it was nothing. Then she told herself a $15,000 wire transfer was nothing. Then she told herself signing a lawsuit full of lies about a 71-year-old man feeding his wife applesauce was nothing. Each step was small enough to swallow, and that's how people end up doing things their younger selves would have refused. I'm not saying this to condemn her. I'm saying it because I think it's the most useful thing I can pass on to anyone listening. The line you don't cross has to be a line you actually drew. If you wait until the moment of temptation to decide who you are, you've already lost the argument. What saved me wasn't courage. I want to be clear about that. I'm not a brave man. What saved me was a habit. For 37 months, I had walked into Desert Bloom and tapped my key card against a sensor, and I had done it without thinking. And I had kept the receipts in a drawer because that's how my mother raised me. And I had taken time-stamped photographs of small moments with Sandra, because I knew I was going to lose those moments, and I wanted to keep something. None of that was strategy. It was just the shape of an ordinary, attentive life. And when the lie came for me, the ordinary life turned out to be the wall the lie couldn't climb. That's what I want my grandchildren to understand. You don't build the wall when you see the storm. You build it every quiet day, in small acts of paying attention, and most of those acts will never matter, and a few of them will save you. And then there's Curtis. My son cried at his mother's bedside and asked me how he could have believed it, and I didn't have a clean answer for him, but I have one now. He believed it because he wanted to, because the alternative required harder questions about his marriage, and harder is what we avoid when we're tired. The lesson there is for me, as much as anyone. The people we love are not exempt from the duty to look. Loving someone doesn't mean trusting their version of every story. It means being willing to ask, gently, whether the story holds, and being willing to live with the answer. I almost lost my son because he wasn't willing to ask. I got him back because, eventually, he was. That's the only kind of strength I really believe in anymore. Not the loud kind. The kind that bends and refuses to break.